It's time for RealAg Radio on Rural Radio Channel 147 on Sirius XM. RealAg Radio and RealAgriculture.com is your home for insight and analysis of the issues that are impacting your farm business. Let's get real and get connected with RealAg Radio. Welcome to RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio 147, Sirius XM. Shaun Haney, your host here on this Wednesday, midweek edition of the show. Thanks so much, everybody, for making RealAg Radio and Rural Radio 147 a big part of your workday. Also, of course, as always, big shout out to be listening out there on the RealAg Radio podcast as well. Good time to drop in if you're not getting our morning newsletters that go out into your email box. You can get those. They're free, actually, by going to realagriculture.com/subscribe. One of the emails that we started to send out that I'm super excited about is the Mind Your Farm Business email. So it's an email that goes out every couple weeks dedicated to farm business issues. So it's got the Mind Your Farm Business podcast, links to the newest episodes of Truth About Ag podcast hosted by Evan Shout. Got stuff on there on BRM programming and HR. Just all of our farm management content goes into that email. So please check that out. So when you go to realagriculture.com/subscribe, you can check that off. That's a good one for you farm managers and CEOs out there. Well, today on the show, looking forward to talking markets with Chuck Penner of LeftField Commodity Research today, based out of Winnipeg. Curious, Chuck's really into seasonality. And so I'm very curious in terms of, based on the variables that are present in 2025 of, tariffs and trade issues and some of the geopolitical overhang that exists out there, what do the fundamentals and the seasonality trends tell us about what's about to happen? Because, trends can be your friend, or if not paid attention to, can maybe be a little bit of your enemy as well. So we'll talk to Chuck Penner today. We got a product spotlight with Ivor Bernatsky from Lemken. Looking forward to having Ivor again on the show today. Some exciting stuff happening with some of their technologies on the seeding and planting side over there at Lemken. And then we'll be joined by David Coletto. He's with Abacus Data. You've seen him all over the mainstream TV. He is one of the best pollsters in the country, and we're going to break down election 2025, winners, losers, and what do we make of all of it? Of course, it looks like the Liberals are going to form a minority government unless they can get the few NDP, three of them, to cross the floor to form a majority government. I'm sure they're working very diligently and hard at that. But what do the Conservatives do? Of course, Pierre Poilievre lost his seat. I think someone resigns and he finds a new one. And it's sort of like one of the things I want to talk to David about today is sort of the good news, bad news sandwich when it comes to the Conservatives. I was trying to figure out what my take was or what my opinion was, and it's very mixed because there's some numbers that really show there's some positives out of this election for the Conservatives from a number perspective and some of the gains they're making. But at the end of the day, they didn't win. And so politics is a winner's game. Andrew Scheer won the popular vote, and he got booted, right? So it's going to be interesting to see what happens to Pierre Poilievre. We're going to break down some of that as well with Coletto and what's the future of the NDP. Hey, the Bloc and the NDP should be very disappointed in terms of some of their showing at the election. So we'd love your feedback on all of that. There's easy ways to get a hold of me. Send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com. You can also, of course, call the RealAg feedback line, 855-776-6147. Oh, the Leafs are leafing. Yes. So I'm sure we'll talk about it on Friday. Kelvin and Lindsay won't be able to leave each other alone when it comes to this. Of course, Lindsay is a big-time Senators fan. Kelvin, a big-time Leafs fan. Those two aren't getting along right now. It's some pretty tough words between the two of them. I don't know if we'll ever repair this relationship. No, they're fine. It's just a pretty intense series. Oilers have turned that one around. Jets are very worried, I think. Jets fan. It's funny how fan bases are just like Oiler fans are sort of like, we're never down. We can just score. We got these two amazing players, and if we could just get okay goaltending and Bouchard takes slap shots, we can do this. And then you have Jets fans who they're up 2-0 and still thought they were going to lose a series. So yeah, it's just fan bases it's just funny how they past experiences. But playoffs been great so far. People tell me the basketball playoffs been great. I have not watched any of it, but I've heard that's been pretty good as well. Great time to be a sports fan, but not a Blue Jays fan in particular because they can't hit. And if you've missed the catch that Varsho made last night, where he fell down in center field and caught the fly, it's all over social media. If you're into sports and all that kind of stuff. Another thing I'm going to have out here very shortly is the results. I think we're going to release them on Monday. I'm hoping for a lot of you in the Real Agriculture Insights panel filled out the Canadian Farmer Sentiment Index survey that was out last week. There's going to be some interesting stuff out of that. See how you are looking at this market and your farm profitability heading into the 2025 planting season. How much better do beef producers feel about their profitability than, say, croppers? We're going to find all of that out next week as well, so stay tuned for that. That's also something that goes in that Mind Your Farm Business email. Lots of reasons to sign up for that Mind Your Farm Business email. Let's take a break. When we come back, we've got Chuck Penner. We're talking markets right after this.
Growing corn? With Envita, you can cut your nitrogen and maintain yield, or maintain nitrogen and increase yield. Envita takes nitrogen from the air and turns it into nitrogen for your corn. It provides a right place, right time source of nitrogen to maximize your yield. Farmers who use Envita see healthier plants, bigger cobs, and less tipback. Envita is guaranteed to add more bushels to every treated acre. Start growing with Envita. Visit azotic.com to learn more. That's AZOTIC.com.
My name is Lindsay Smith, and it is time for today's Product Spotlight. Joining me now is Jason Mann. He's the president of Genesis Fertilizers. Let's talk about how the Arctic Gateway route and Genesis Fertilizers, how working together is really helping to hedge Genesis Fertilizers against some of the trade uncertainty that's out there.
If we come up with a supply chain that's outside of North America for our phosphate, presumably we would bypass this tariff threat, first of all. So, as far as supply chain, if we build our own supply chain, our own collaborating with Arctic Gateway Group to have facilities at the Port of Churchill that are dedicated to bringing in phosphate. Now we control our own supply chain. We're not reliant on another provider to get the product into Western Canada. Farmers can take that into their own hands, and we can purchase in advance, bring the product in ahead of the season, and make sure that we have the quantities we need when we need it.
Where can people go if they've still got questions, or if they, of course, want to invest and become involved?
Well, best is always go to the website, genesisfertilizers.com.
And welcome back to RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio 147. We're going to talk markets here on this Wednesday. But first, tracking livestock, it just got easier. The CLTS movement module records animals' movements off premises. Although this is not yet a requirement under the regulation, CCIA has streamlined reporting to prepare for future changes to support compliance. You can learn more by going to support.canadaid.ca. Joining us right now to talk markets here on RealAg Radio is Chuck Penner of LeftField Commodity Research, based out of the most friendliest of Winnipeg, Manitoba. How are you doing, Chuck?
Doing okay. That livestock tracking thing would have been great when I was a kid and the cattle got out of the fence and whatever. Boy, that would have been, and that was before the days of ATVs and stuff like that. So yeah, that would have been fantastic.
I've had a few members of the audience say, "Can I get these things for my kids?" As they're all over the place, and
just call them, just get air tags. Whatever.
Exactly. Probably you don't have to go through the whole idea of also applying the tag as well. Probably
that too.
Less painful. I don't know if you can get away with that nowadays. Okay, Chuck, markets. I guess the equity market is extremely focused on impact of tariffs, threats of tariffs. How's the commodity market reacting to all of this right now?
Well, I think it's kind of maybe in a bit of a period of wishful thinking or hoping all of this just goes away. For the most part, our commodities that we're trading with the U.S. are still under the USMCA or the CUSMA or depending which country you're in, how the abbreviation goes. But those are still under that agreement. And so we've been able to avoid that for the most part for our ag commodities. And that can always change. My expectation, though, is that the worst of that turmoil is past, and now some more logical thinking is occurring, and so on. So I'm kind of hoping on that front, we're seeing that kind of fade away. I think China is still a bit of a wild card. There are people who have suggested that, well, maybe China will scale back the tariffs on peas and on canola products and so on. I think that's more wishful thinking than anything. And then there's always the possibility that they slap some tariffs on canola seed yet too. So there is that kind of stuff. But I think the most part, markets are trading more on fundamentals, and now we're getting into the weather season for a lot of these crops and things like that. So there's just a lot more buzz about that. That doesn't mean this has disappeared entirely, but we're getting back to thinking about the things we usually think about.
Yeah, so if we are focused on fundamentals right now, are they becoming more of the focus? What are the fundamentals telling us about the broader market?
Well, we're really watching what's going on we start in the wheat market, and we're watching what goes on in the winter wheat market. And then, of course, we're starting to see planting of the spring wheat crop and so on. There are areas of concern of dryness. I was looking at a map yesterday of Western Canada, and, that northern tier of the prairies, really hasn't had any rain in the last 30 days. And it's been drier already a little bit earlier in the year. So, not that it's a imminent problem, but it's a concern. Northern U.S., Montana, especially eastern Montana, western North Dakota, those are drying out as well too. So those kind of things that are specific to crops that we grow here are starting to become a little more prominent. Again, we're just getting into seeding now, so you can't really kill the crop yet, and so we hope for the best. But those are things that we're watching anyway.
Yeah, and U.S. planting progress has, it's been pretty healthy.
Yeah, people get wound up about, corn planting is 2% behind average, and like, come on, they can make that up in an afternoon. It's really not a big deal. But people like me need something to talk about, I suppose, and so we latch onto some unimportant statistic and try to move the markets or claim that the markets move because of that, when it may be other things going on too.
So I know you're big on seasonality. And so
Yes.
we're at the back end of April here. Last day of April. Seasonally speaking, what does this tell us in terms of where we go from here?
Yeah, I mean, each crop kind of has a little bit different seasonal pattern, and so we track each of them differently. So there are some, like Durum, for example, tends to just like start in January and start sliding lower for until it hits the harvest lows. Other ones like spring wheat or canola or red lentils, for example, there is a real pattern toward a seasonal, a spring peak in the seasonals. Now, spring wheat hasn't really moved at all. The basis has improved, but spring wheat really hasn't improved much at all in the spring months. Canola has. Red lentils have been pretty flat as well too. But one of the universals across basically all crops is that once you kind of get to, at latest early June, early to mid June, prices just slide during the summer. And then everybody goes bananas again and thinks, oh, there's something terribly wrong with the market. And why is it doing this? Well, it does that every summer. And so, if there are people who, need to get some pricing done, probably want to look at getting that done sooner rather than later, because that seasonal tendency is almost inevitable. I mean, 21-22 was maybe the exception. Even then, there was it started to decline, and then when the drought really kicked in, then it bounced fairly quickly.
Yeah.
But it happens like every year, and so even in canola that looks really strong, and there's really good reasons for canola to be strong. There's tight supplies, and we're still moving and crushing, still exporting and crushing at a really good clip, and so on. There's really good reasons to think that market should just keep going higher, until whenever. But it's not going to. Like there's no guarantees, but I can almost guarantee that one. At some point, it may be delayed by a week or two or something like that, and it may not be a large dip, but it's going to do it at some point.
Yeah. So curious, and this is a broad question, so different commodities may behave differently, but do the spreads maintain as we see that slumber or summer doldrum and we see a bit of a drop off? Do the spreads hold?
That July NOV spread in canola is really a tough one. I mean, it's one to watch now. I mean, we got what have we got? We've got a $40 inverse right now, July NOV spread, and again, that's a signal that at some point the buyers are just going to back away. The crushers have the coverage that they need, but that spread, it doesn't always, narrow in the way the textbooks say it should. And so, the other spreads, if you look at the NOV Jan, we've got about $8 there, which is close to full carry. So that's fairly normal. So it's looking already ahead to next year and saying, we're at this point anyway, we're looking at a more reasonable supply situation.
Yeah, you mentioned on canola there's a good fundamental story. That may have some people listening to this and scratching their head because I thought there was nothing but trouble in the canola market. Is the bulk of that product still making its way because it's seed going to China, or is it crush product going to the U.S. for renewable diesel and SAF, or what's happening?
Yeah, when we look at the canola market, I mean, we've looked at it a lot, actually, in the last while. We've had some extra research work and things like that surrounding that. And, we've always said that the 24-25 season isn't really going to get affected by that because we have drawn down supplies so much this year already. This year isn't really going to get affected by that. And so that's why we're seeing this year's move, there. But those are still large risks, from China on the seed. Again, don't know for sure they're going to do that, or when they're going to do that, or that sort of thing. It would also help, for example, if China would start allowing Australian canola in, because then where Australian canola is going, Canadian canola can go to, right? But the situation in the U.S. with their biofuels policy, I think, is even aside from tariffs that might show up on from the U.S., which I'm kind of discounting now, but the changes in biofuel policy, because when we look at where our canola oil has gone the last couple of months, January and February, it's already started to shift away from the U.S. They're still the main buyer. Don't get me wrong, and they will remain that way. But we're starting to send it to more different places. Now, the March crush volumes were back up again. So there's no, that's a positive sign that we're going to keep crushing and moving it, whether it's to the U.S. or to somewhere else. But there are risks. There still are risks in that market for sure.
There's been a lot of bullish commentary coming out of the White House and some members of the cabinet in regards to the U.S. having some sort of a trade deal with India. How could, and of course we're speculating here, we don't know what that would actually involve and entail. India is a very difficult trade partner on a good day. Any impacts there you're watching for from a U.S. or from a Canadian export perspective we need to be watching out for?
I don't really think so. What they've done in the past, for example, they arranged a trade deal with Australia. So Australian lentils come in at a 5% tariff, Canadian lentils at a 10% tariff. So there is a price impact in Canada in order to keep getting our lentils moving into India, but it's not a huge deal. When it comes to the U.S., they might export some green lentils there, not really any peas at now already. So from the pulses perspective, and that would be the effect. I don't think that the U.S. has a whole lot that India wants, to put it bluntly, in terms of pulses, but it makes for good press.
Yeah. Before we wrap up here, any other commodity that sort of we haven't discussed here, or you want to make sure you hit on that growers need to be aware of in terms of some of the price action?
Yeah, there's been some, when I look at the durum market, for example, earlier we were a lot friendlier toward that market, and I think others were as well too. So we weren't necessarily an outlier, but that optimism is fading. Prices in Italy are sliding, which is kind of a bit of a benchmark. They've had rain in North Africa with the harvest getting closer, and we're looking at bigger crops in Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, bigger Italian crop for sure this year. Very good conditions there. So, some of the optimism, there are still some pretty good new crop pricing opportunities for durum. And so, I think that's something that should be looked at, because I'm not sure that some of that optimism, I think some of that optimism in the durum market is maybe going to fade over time, and people are going to be a little disappointed maybe next year.
Well, what about oats? What's going on there?
Well, that's again one that we had a whole lot of angst about with respect to the U.S. market, and so far that doesn't seem to be playing out. And again, I don't think that at this stage that the U.S. is going to all of a sudden, okay, now we're going to impose on tariffs on Canadian ag products and oats. The USMCA, or whatever you want to call it, will be renegotiated in 26. That may have an effect a little bit later on, but I think most of the food products and that kind of thing are really going to be able to slide under the radar on those and keep going. So on the oat market, it's looking stable, friendly-ish. But the U.S. isn't buying, the last couple of years haven't bought as much as they used to buy. So, we can probably do with a little bit smaller crop here.
Are they getting their oats elsewhere, or are they just demands decreased?
I think they're getting more domestically, from what I can see anyway. So consumption is still the same, but they grow like lots of oats, but they only typically take about a third of their oats to harvest. So doesn't take much to change that balance. Yeah.
Chuck, thanks a lot for joining us here today. Really appreciate it.
You bet, Sean.
That is Chuck Penner, LeftField Commodity Research. Encourage you to check out his service. Puts out some great information, great newsletters, and like I said, based out of Winnipeg, Manitoba. Well, now we talked about dealing with your market risk. Don't put your yield at risk either. Put your trust in proven solutions. Anvil Nitrogen Stabilizer, Super U Premium Fertilizer, and Tribune Nitrogen Stabilizer from Koch Agronomic Services. These products offer higher active ingredient concentrations that imitator brands just can't match. See the difference at defendyourn.ca. When we come back on RealAg Radio, we got a product spotlight with Ivor Bernatsky from Lemken. We'll be right back right after this.
If you grow soy or edible beans in Ontario, you know that Sclerotinia white mold is no joke. Yield loss can be devastating, and timing fungicides can be complicated, but did you know there's a new seed treatment that can help mitigate yield loss? Start the year off with your best foot forward against disease. Ask your seed supplier or local Agrimart group to pre-treat your beans with Heads Up. Part of a complete white mold management plan, ask your seed dealer about Heads Up today or visit headsupst.com.
Get all the information you need to keep your pulse crop healthy and profitable with the Pulse School on RealAgriculture.com. The Pulse School is a free YouTube video series covering agronomy, research, and more across a host of different pulse crops. It's also available as an audio podcast wherever you download or stream your favorite podcast. Check us out on YouTube or visit RealAgriculture.com. The Pulse School, brought to you by BSF Canada.
I'm Lindsay Smith from RealAgriculture.com. Join me Monday nights for The Agronomist, a 1-hour live and interactive show broadcast across YouTube, Facebook, and X. Monday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern, I host expert agronomists from all over the country to give you answers to some of the toughest agronomic questions. Join us live or catch the replay Tuesday morning. That's The Agronomist with me, Lindsay Smith, Monday nights live at 8 p.m. Eastern.
And welcome back to RealAg Radio. It's now time for a product spotlight with Lemken. We're talking to Ivor Bernatsky, who is Lemken's North American Marketing Manager. Ivor, it's great to have you on the show.
Thanks, Sean. Great to be here again.
Yeah, so lots of exciting stuff happening at Lemken. There's always innovations. There's also always new stuff happening all the time. And we're going to talk about 4 machines that you have deployed out in the field. And spring is here. And so give us a bit of an update.
Yeah, we're excited to be rolling all across Canada. We have, as you go east to west, we are starting off with our planter, the equalizer planter. Last year we were demoing, and this year over the winter we sold an 8-row planter on 30-inch rows. set up for dry and liquid. It's all decked out with everything you could lay into it with precision planting. That is an exciting opportunity. The farmer knew about precision planting technology, saw how it was laid out, liked it. It's a small footprint, big wheels, low compaction, that everything folds, although whether or not it's the 8-row, 12-row, 24-row, and they all roll up to forward. So those 8, 12, 16, and 24 row, all in 30-inch spacings. They can handle liquid or dry, and in a lot of cases, people are just shocked with the fact that it from factory will deliver and distribute the dry as well. That is a huge cost savings for them. And then once they're in their cab, everything's run off the Precision Planting 2020 monitor. So it makes life simple as well. So that's rolling in Ontario. And then as we come across to Western Canada, we have some machines that are running already. We have our disc drill, the equalizer disc drill, which is on 10-inch row spacing. It's a 40-foot drill. It can be set up with the equalizer tow-between tank. That's getting ready to run some demos. We have sold our first equalizer airtime drill and a tow-between cart. And we're really excited about that. That has just been delivered up to a farm north of Edmonton, and they're getting ready to roll.
Oh, that's exciting. And if we've talked about the equalizer before, this is an exciting time for Lemken.
It is. It's really critical. We're ready to go. Lemken has been in Western Canada or all across Canada for 20 years. We have great dealers. We've got great people. We're set up, although we've really been well known for tillage. We've been making seeding equipment for over 20 years. We just felt that it wasn't quite the right time to do the full-blown push of all the machines until we had that full offering that Equalizer brought us in 2023, when they brought us the disruptive but still conventional disc drill or hole drill, either one. That the hole drill, what we call the airtime drill, is either at 40, 60, or 80 feet with that toe between or toe behind cart that comes with it. That really steps into being competitive anywhere in Western Canada from the size perspective. But farmers are really intrigued by the vertical banding that machine offers, where we're going down to about 5.5 inches is maximum depth, and it creates an inverted cone where that's about 3 inches across the top. Fertilizer, dry or liquid, is mixed in with that soil, spread out nicely. It also opens up that soil for the roots to grow vertically. That fertilizer is sitting exactly where the roots want it to be. We don't have to worry about nutrient stratification. It doesn't have to go over to the side row or to the mid row. It just grows vertically. I'm really excited to bring something new to Western Canada because nobody's interested in just seeing another color paint on the same type of technology. They want to see something that's cost effective and brings in great technology.
Well, and of course, the Lemken brand has great value. People know they can trust it in its quality products. And it's very exciting times getting in the planter and seeder market. If somebody wants to find out more, Ivor, and maybe even get a demo, because I know that's definitely one of the offers here. What do they do?
They can go to lemkendemo.com, or they can talk to any of our dealers, or if they find themselves available around July the 22nd, we are right now seeding about 300 acres at the Western Crop Innovations site in Lacombe. They have a field day on July the 22nd. So we have 3 different machines running with 4 different crops that they'll be able to see in the ground. We'll have those machines there doing demos at the same time. So whether or not it's a demo in their field, where they're going to lemkendemo.com, or they're showing up at the Western Crop Innovation Field Day, we can show them how the technology works.
Oh, that's great. Even better to be able to see, some of the results of that seed coming out of the ground and then what that emergence looks like, because that's really the key to getting that crop off to a good start and some of those higher yields that everybody is pushing for. Ivor, thanks so much for joining us here today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Shaun.
And again, everybody, that's lemkendemo.com. We'll be back on RealAg Radio, Roll Radio 147, right after this.
Find everything you need for outstanding weed control in your wheat and barley from the cross-spectrum herbicide experts at Corteva. Corteva is proud to offer a wide selection of cross-spectrum herbicides for maximum convenience, effective resistance management, and customized control of your toughest grassy and broadleaf weeds. No matter what kind of weed challenges you're experiencing, we've got the right fit for your farm. Visit corteva.ca to learn more.
If you're involved in the agriculture industry, it's important to stay informed on all the latest issues affecting your business. At RealAgriculture.com, we offer fast, reliable news, information, and insights to help you keep on top of all of the latest in Canadian agriculture. Visit RealAgriculture.com and sign up for our free daily newsletter covering everything from news, agronomy, animal agriculture, and much more. Visit RealAgriculture.com/subscribe today.
And welcome back to RealAg Radio. Hey, don't put your yield at risk. Put your trust in proven solutions. Anvil Nitrogen Stabilizer, Super U Premium Fertilizer, and Tribune Nitrogen Stabilizer from Koch Agronomic Services. These products offer higher active ingredient concentrations, imitator brands. They just can't match. See the difference at defendyourn.ca. There's a lot of pollsters. They're imitators as well. But one of the best in the business is David Coletto of Abacus Data, and he joins us right now. Hey, David, how are you doing?
Hi, Shaun. Good to be here.
Busy time for a pollster.
It is still busy. I mean, the election's really busy in the last few days before it sort of ramps up. But now everybody's doing their kind of debrief, postmortem, what happened, why.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, still busy, catching up on a little sleep. But it's a fascinating night.
Yeah, at the end of the day, and I know post-ops, there's always the pollsters got it right. Did they get it wrong? That 2% difference in the popular vote, the number was different at the end of the day, but that gap between the Liberals and the Conservatives, that shook out just as you had sort of forecasted on Sunday.
Yeah, I mean, most pollsters, there were a handful who got it right, dead on. We overestimated the NDP, which was our reason we had the top line numbers off a little bit. But yeah, that 2-3 point gap that we had seen for most of this campaign, we never really had the Liberals ahead by 10 or 11 like some other pollsters. I always thought this race was going to be closer than I think a lot of people thought or were commenting on. And in the end of the day, yeah, the polls did well. So this was not a polling failure. You can believe the polls, and particularly Abacus Data's polls, as you said.
Well, good stuff. And I encourage everybody to go to abacusdata.com. David and his team do great work. That's why we have him on here. And I appreciate he's doing tons of mainstream stuff. And I do appreciate you giving us some time here to talk to farmers and ranchers across Canada. Speaking of farmers and ranchers, let's get to it. Kelvin Hepner and I had looked at the electoral map. Visually, it sure looks like the rural-urban divide is very alive and well. Is that what the numbers are saying?
It is, and I think one of the things that this election did not change. There were some important changes in demographics, in a bunch of other factors, but that urban-rural divide, I don't know if it became sharper, but it certainly didn't weaken, right? And when I combined our last 3 surveys and get a bigger sample size, and I can go and look at folks who said, look, the first 3 digits of my postal code have a 0 in the middle, they were almost 20 points more likely to vote. The Conservatives won by 20 points, 47 Conservative, 28 Liberal. And then among the rest of the country, the Liberals were ahead by 3. So that gap is still very large and is persistent and is different, obviously, in different parts of the country. In Western Canada, I think more rural communities overwhelmingly voted Conservative, as I think they've done over the last number of elections. Atlantic Canada, a little different in terms of that, but yeah, the big picture is this is still a very sharp divide in our country, and there was no indication, despite how a lot of the rest of the country kind of moved back to the Liberal fold. the folks living in more rural communities don't seem to have done that. What is the same, though, in both rural and urban Canada is the NDP vote collapsed, and it collapsed everywhere, whether it was Saskatchewan or British Columbia or Ontario. So that, I think, is probably the biggest factor explaining why the Liberals pulled off a fourth win, despite, a few months ago, Shaun, I'm sure I was on your show saying, Pierre Poilievre certain to win the next election unless something fundamentally changed. And we got some of those fundamental changes, which I think.
It seems like, though, as we went west, the NDP did recover a little bit, because it was as we were going through the results, Ontario into Manitoba, it was like 4.5%. I think they finished off 6 or something like that.
Over 6.
Yeah.
But let me give you one story. I mean, not a story, but one data point. In Saskatchewan, the home of Tommy Douglas, the birthplace of the CCF and the NDP, they got 7% or so of the vote. That is historically, it's historically low everywhere. But when the NDP last had a bad election like this, which you have to go all the way back to 1993, they still got 23% of the vote in Saskatchewan. So they have lost yes, they've got, pockets of support. They've got 7 MPs elected, but, the NDP has a lot of work to do, I think, now, if they're going to get relevant again at all.
Yeah, now with being 3 seats short of the majority, obviously now we watch to see if some of those leaderless NDP seats cross the floor, which is, I think, what a lot of people are watching closely now. Now, the Bloc, also a disappointment?
Well, certainly, yeah. They didn't get wiped off the map, but they lost, 10 or 11 seats in Quebec. And if you just looked at the country east of Ontario, the Liberals were on their way to majority. They achieved what they needed to do in Quebec by getting, at 42% of the vote, winning a number of Bloc seats. Even yesterday, one flipped over as the vote continued just outside of Montreal. So the Bloc had not a great night, had a hard time being relevant. They still have, 22 seats, so it's not an insignificant number, but the Liberals made big gains in Quebec, which they had to do if they were going to get to the majority. The rest of the country, though, as you got west of Quebec, spoiled their plans a little bit. In Ontario in particular, and I think the prairies, where many people thought the Liberals might make some gains in Calgary and Saskatoon and Edmonton, that did not materialize.
No.
And they lost 1 seat in Calgary, the Liberals, and they gained 1. But, they still now only have 2 seats they don't even have 1 in Edmonton anymore. I don't even know. So I think they've got 2 seats in Alberta as they had before, and only 1 in Saskatchewan now because of that northern seat, that the boundaries changed that made it very Liberal friendly.
Yeah, I think one of those, I think there's an NDP seat in Edmonton.
That's right. Sorry, yeah. So they've got 1 seat in Alberta. So Corey Hogan, who's the lone Liberal elected in Calgary, I suspect will be a cabinet minister when that's
you think. BC go more conservative than maybe you thought? I seen a lot of blue there.
Yeah, BC moved in 2 different directions. I think the interior of British Columbia, as the NDP vote collapsed, a lot of that vote went to the Conservatives. So other than Kelowna, which I think is an artifact of an older population voting Liberal more across the country, outside of Kelowna, it's blue. And then you get towards the lower mainland, and the Liberals did quite well. Liberals won the popular vote in British Columbia, which they almost never do. And they even picked up a few seats on Vancouver Island. So yeah, it's turned even BC into really a 2-party province where the NDP vote is down into the teens, which is, again, historically bad for them.
Yeah, that Kelowna race was tight. Like 1 poll to go, it was like 160 vote difference. And older Canadians, but also probably some influence, people moving from Vancouver. I wonder if that played a role.
Yeah, retirees from Vancouver, I think, are the perfect. Those were the folks like that that saved the Liberals. That's why they won. There's a seat outside of Toronto, Bay of Quinte, that has Belleville, but the Prince Edward County, the so-called county for those folks who live around Toronto, lots of, transplants from Toronto who went and retired in that beautiful part of the province. Same kind of thing. That seat went Liberal as well.
What did Gen Z and millennials do?
Well, that was an interesting part of the story. I think, this election showed us that those demographics flipped. So if older voters were more inclined to vote Liberal, then we saw a real persistent support for the Conservatives among those younger cohorts, right, who weren't interested or as focused on Trump. They were much more likely to be telling us in the polls that we did that they were still focused on housing, on the cost of living, on their own economic security. And while Trump was sort of looming still over them, they were less focused on that. And so the Conservatives, I think we're going to see, did better among older voters than they had previously. And that split, particularly among younger men, was wide. Young men and young women really went in two different directions. And that will be one of the stories. Just as an aside, because I'm fascinated by this, there's an organization called Civics that does the student vote every year, right? So while we're voting, as those of age are voting, kids in secondary and elementary school do mock elections. And so there were 900,000 students who voted, and the Conservatives won for the first time the student vote, which I think is reflective of that, one, the influence the Conservatives have had at telling a story to young people about the future, about the insecurity that they're feeling, and their desire to see change. And so if there's one thing to talk about, even though the Conservatives lost, is it looks like their coalition of voters, if it holds, are younger and therefore maybe more durable over the long term. And if I'm going to find silver linings for the Conservatives, it's that maybe their future does look a little bit brighter because they've found a way to connect with young voters in a way that conservative parties have really had a hard time doing in the past.
Yeah, I've read some of that commentary from some analysts. It's really fascinating. When I think of, like, you think back, I don't know, 8-10 years, beginning of the Trudeau, time as prime minister, the young vote was just, young people all behind him. The Conservatives were the older, crotchety, older white Canadians, and things have entirely flipped here. It's absolutely fascinating. Like, how do you, like, when you view this, how do you see it?
Yeah, I mean, if I'm going to simplify it for your listeners and watchers and viewers, I think it's Mark Carney, the older candidate in this race of the three main party leaders. Not that age is always important. Young people loved Bernie Sanders, for example, and he was in his 60s and 70s when he was running for president. But Mark Carney represented stability. He was not the conservative candidate, but a version of, like, status quo, right? We want security, we want safety. And Pierre Poilievre, I think, represented disruption. And for some, disruption's a bad thing, and for others, it's a good thing. Because if you think the world and your life is hard, and that there's systems in place that are protecting certain interests or making it easy for that boomer to keep their home, but making it impossible for me to buy one, then you're going to seek someone who wants to shake it up, right? And I think Pierre Poilievre was that for half this country, who were looking for that kind of thing. And I think young people were much more likely to be inclined for that. So I think they were looking, at the end of the, throughout the campaign, Poilievre talked about his version of the future looked hopeful. I want to bring hope back to people, they live in safe streets and buy their homes. That really did appeal to younger Canadians. Not to say that older Canadians don't want those things, but they were much more focused on what they thought was the existential threat of Trump, as opposed to the existential threat of a world that, makes it hard for me just to do the things I thought I should be able to do by a certain age.
We're talking to David Coletto from Abacus Data. With volatile markets and rising costs, now's your chance to be a part of the solution. It's time to secure your future with Genesis Fertilizers. Gain control and ensure access to locally produced nitrogen. Act now to protect your farm's future for generations. Visit genesisfertilizers.com to learn more. We're back with more with David Coletto right after this quick break.
Right now, people in agriculture and food are facing challenges that can feel overwhelming. If you need to talk, access the National Farm Crisis Line at 1-866-FARMS-01. That's 1-866-327-6701. It's 24/7 confidential help when you need it. Farm Credit Canada also has tools to support your long-term mental health. Learn more and access the crisis line at fcc.ca/wellness.
The Canola School on RealAgriculture.com is your one-stop shop for everything a canola grower needs. check out our free video series on YouTube for all the latest in canola agronomy, research, marketing, and more. Don't have time to watch? Download the podcast version of the Canola School on RealAgriculture.com or anywhere you download your podcasts. Stay on top of all things canola with the Canola School on RealAgriculture.com, brought to you by BASF and Invigor Hybrid Canola.
Welcome back to RealAg Radio, and we're talking to David Coletto from Abacus Data about putting a bit of a wrap on the Monday night's election. This segment's brought to you by Ag Expert, deep in the fields and deep in the data to back up your decisions on the farm. Get started at agexpert.ca. As somebody that resides in Alberta, you can imagine what my inbox, the messages it was full of on Tuesday morning. The Canadian Shield, it visually now, if you looked at the electoral map, it really looks like it's not only a physical barrier, it's a bit of a political divide here. I'm curious if you have done any polling yet. Like, I've been sort of speculating, although this election was about Trump for Carney, his greatest challenge may actually be national unity, not Trump. What are your numbers showing you there? If you've asked?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, I think what voters showed up and said in Alberta and Saskatchewan in particular, and maybe in the interior British Columbia, like, they're very similar than the coast, is that while the Liberal vote went up, they didn't make a breakthrough, right? They did not win seats in many of those many seats in those provinces. And so with 60+% of the vote in Alberta voting Conservative, with close to the same proportion in Saskatchewan voting that way, I do think we've it wasn't long ago we were talking about a national unity crisis involving Quebec again, because you may have had the Bloc as the official opposition, and we may still get a PQ government in Quebec next year when Quebec votes. But now it looks more likely that we'll be talking about how do we and our Western Canadians comfortable and feeling part of the country. And you have Preston Manning and Daniel Smith even yesterday saying, look, if citizens in Alberta initiate a referendum, we're not going to stop it. And so I think that will be a big part of Mark Carney's agenda. And I think, he said it himself in his victory speech on Monday night. But I also think he's got to be very careful, because he also said something that I thought was risky, in which he described his version of change as one that's tied to Canadian values. And if you were somebody who voted Conservative or was strongly opposed to the Liberals and you heard that, you might be wondering, is he saying I'm not Canadian? That the things I believe are not the same values as his? So we have to be really careful. And this election, wasn't the whole country didn't rally around Mark Carney, and we were rallying around the flag, but we were rallying around two versions of that flag. Yeah. And I think we're as divided as we were before this election, even if Trump is uniting us in different ways.
Conservatives are very much a good news, bad news sandwich, becoming very good at being the bridesmaid here. I guess, how do you break down? There's a lot of people painting a bad picture, people painting a very positive picture. Of course, we don't know what the future is for Pierre Poilievre. He lost his riding of Carleton in a very close race, I guess. What would you say about the Conservative campaign and where they go from here?
Yeah, I mean, it really is a mixed bag, and you can pick out the good stuff and the bad stuff. Highest popular vote that the Conservatives have had since the parties merged in 2003, better than Stephen Harper did in 2011. Far more voters. So that's the upside if you're a Conservative. The downside is that wasn't enough, and it wasn't nearly enough for you to make the kind of gains you need in terms of seats, because the NDP vote collapsed and it consolidated around the Liberals. I don't think we are in for a long-term two-party system. I do believe the NDP will be back. I think there's a natural audience and environment that will see an NDP continue to exist. But that being said, I think Conservatives still have to ask themselves, once Justin Trudeau stepped out of the spotlight and he was the thing that was holding that larger Conservative coalition together, they still needed to give people in some parts of this country a reason to vote for them. And I think that's going to be some of the reflection. But look, Pierre Poilievre in our tracking anyways, was not a deeply unpopular person when this campaign ended. He was not as popular as Mark Carney. And so Mark Carney came around at the right time and appealed to far more people because of who he was and the environment that people were in. But, I look at this and I say, I'm very objective. I'm not partisan, but I say, as much as this is a defeat for conservatives, they should still be bullish in the future opportunities. And this may be the next step in a series of steps to get them to a place where they can win a durable majority. But it's still a work in progress. And the challenge remains, without much support in Quebec, you've got to sweep the lower mainland and the GTA in order to win a majority in Canada. And you've got to do certainly better in Atlantic Canada as well.
It was within their grasp, for sure. My personal opinion, they should have showed more of the Pierre Poilievre in his Carleton riding standing in the back of that pickup truck on Sunday. They should have showed that throughout the campaign. It was a different version of Poilievre that I think would have shown up a lot better in some of the ridings where they were unsuccessful. And that's my personal opinion. David, thanks so much for joining us here today. I really do appreciate it. And keep up the great work there at Abacus Data.
Thanks, Sean. Always a pleasure.
That was David Coletto of Abacus Data. Man, there are so many different angles to all of this. I could talk about this election for the next few weeks, but we're probably going to have to move on and see what happens. Is there going to be some floor crossing, which is very possible? Are we going to see coalition government around topics versus an official agreement like they had previously? The Trudeau Liberals had with the NDP. I would lean more to if I was the Carney government, I'd be trying to find 3 NDP seats that would be willing to cross the floor. You're going to have to promise probably some pretty big things, like say a cabinet position. How does that go in terms of the rest of the party, people hanging by? Of course, who's going to be the ag minister? Will it be Cody Blois? He's got to be the favorite. Nothing is for certain, though. I know this. I described Cody Blois at the Ag Leaders debate. We've had Cody on the show quite a bit here, but I think for a lot of Canadians, Mr. Blois, very much the Ag Leaders debate, if you don't follow politics on a daily basis, it was a bit of a coming out party. The Trudeau Liberals had him parked away. They had him hid. Clearly knows the ag file. He was chair of the ag committee, and he performed quite well at the Ag Leaders debate, knows the topics, and is very interested. He may be from Nova Scotia, but don't come on, not understanding West issues. Dude has spent a lot of time traveling across the country. So I think if he is selected as the ag minister, I think there's going to be a lot of people in agriculture given that good choice, but we'll have to see what happens. And of course, once they do make that selection and the announcement of who's in the cabinet, we will have that new ag minister on the program here to find out what some of their ideas are, the priorities are, and of course the mandate letters. We'll see what they look and how they look different. Like, how different are they from what we saw in the Trudeau mandate letters? That's the other part that we'll be watching very closely as well. Now, if you have any feedback on today's show, we'd love to hear from you. Send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com, or of course you can call the Real Ag feedback line, 855-776-6147. Thanks everybody for getting real and getting connected with Real Ag Radio. And of course, we will chat again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. In the spirit of basketball playoffs, welcome to the bonus, baby. Okay, yeah, we're going to do some news today. I want to get to... I promise you, I'm trying to do more of these bonus segments where we get through some of the news. I promise you, okay? I'm coming through today. I am coming through today for you. I appreciate everybody out there listening to the RealAg Radio podcast version of the show. Thank you so much. And by the way, big news coming. Big news coming. We've got some news about RealAg on the weekend. Stay tuned for that. There's some big news coming in a couple days here on RealAg on the weekend, which is our weekend show on terrestrial radio. So stay tuned. I tease that as best I possibly can. Okay, from a news perspective, let's look at, there's a lot happening. Prime Minister Mark Carney, there is going to be some focus on economics. We know this. Canada's gross domestic Product contracted by 0.2% in February on a monthly basis for the first time since November, as activities across mining, oil, and gas construction sectors shrunk, according to data released on Wednesday from the Globe and Mail. Well, a part of the decline was due to bad weather conditions and snowstorms across provinces in February. The Bank of Canada and economists have predicted that growth will continue to totter in the coming months due to the impact of U.S. tariffs. U.S. President Donald Trump, constant threat of tariffs, forced many to bring forward purchases, which can be seen in uptick in manufacturing numbers in February. We're going to get to some of those U.S. numbers here in a second. But as inventories build up, tariff fears have started to impact demand and investments, and this has started to show across economic indicators. The economy is likely to expand by 0.1% in March, and on an annualized basis, the GDP is expected to grow by 1.5% in the first quarter, according to StatsCan. Well, speaking of the U.S., the U.S. economy has contracted in the first 3 months of 2025 as businesses rushed to stock up on imports ahead of the Trump administration's tariffs and consumer spending slowed. The Commerce Department said that U.S. gross domestic product, the value of all goods and services produced across the economy, fell at a seasonally and inflation-adjusted 0.3% annual rate in the first quarter. That was the first contraction since the first quarter of 2022. Consumer spending, the economy's main engine, rose at 1.8% pace in the first quarter, the smallest increase since mid-2023. Spending by the federal government fell as the Department of Government Efficiency cut jobs and contracts. But the main driver, according to the Wall Street Journal, of the first quarter contraction was Trump's trade war. Net exports, the difference between what the U.S. imports and exports, subtracted nearly 5 percentage points from headline GDP. That was the biggest quarterly drag from net exports on record, dating back to 1947. On Truth Social as well, the president posted that the stock market is not his stock market, it's Biden's stock market. And once these tariffs kick in, it's going to be a great thing for America. I'm paraphrasing what he said. That's kind of me summing up what that post was. The volume of Chinese goods packed in containers bound for the U.S. keeps falling as new U.S. tariffs dent demand, with the biggest ocean carriers shifting to smaller ships to move the reduced loads while other companies cancel sailings. So a lot of focus on what's happening in the ocean freight market. This story also from the Wall Street Journal. The world's 5 largest container ships operators say bookings for eastbound Trans-Pacific shipments are down at least a third. These biggest carriers say they haven't started canceling sailings outright yet, but they're replacing behemoths that carry up to 18,000 containers with vessels maxing out at about 14,500 boxes, as measured by the industry standard 20-foot equivalent units. Smaller operators have canceled around 24 sailings from China to the U.S. West Coast so far for May, according to brokers in Singapore and London. Port of Los Angeles Executive Director Gene Soroka said he expects container arrivals to be down 30.4% this week from last week. He added that 17 sailings scheduled for May have been canceled so far. The Port of Los Angeles and adjacent Port of Long Beach together make up the biggest U.S. port complex. Curious if less ships are coming from China to the U.S. or they're smaller ships. What does that mean for exports out of the U.S.? Because you don't have that return. If smaller ships are coming to the U.S., there's smaller ships shipping out as well, and the bigger ones are parked, I guess. It's fascinating to kind of watch that, and the Journal does a great job of following that. A story on RealAgriculture.com, agri-stability enrollment deadline has been extended to the end of July. Farmers and ranchers across Canada will have 3 more months to decide whether to sign up for the agri-stability business risk management program. The federal, provincial, and territorial governments announced on last Friday they have agreed to extend the enrollment deadline for the 2025 program year from April 30th, which is today, to July 31st. Quote here from Saskatchewan Agriculture Minister Darrell Harrison. He said, "The uncertainty of current market disruptions and tariffs reinforces the importance of our business risk management programs. It provides producers with additional time to evaluate their risk management options." On the eve of the federal election, of course, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada and new federal Agriculture Minister Cody Blois proposed changes to the margin-based program aimed at offsetting farmers' lost income due to tariffs. The changes, which have not yet been implemented or formally agreed to by the provinces, included raising the compensation rate from 80 to 90% and doubling the payment cap to $6 million per farm. And, of course, Saskatchewan, actually, I think Saskatchewan was one of the provinces that really pushed back on those changes. Department of Justice drops their theft charge against South Dakota ranchers Charles and Heather Maud. The U.S. Department of Justice has dropped the criminal charges against Caputa, South Dakota ranchers Charles and Heather Maud, who have been accused of improperly using U.S. Forest Service land. On June 20th of 2024, a grand jury indicted the Mauds for the theft of government property. The indictment alleged that they did knowingly steal, purloin, and convert to their own use national grasslands managed by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, approximately about 50 acres. A letter U.S. Senator Mike Rounds, a Republican from South Dakota, wrote to Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack in July of 24, said the Maud family held permit agreements with the U.S. Forest Service for nearly 60 years, during which time the USFS has repeatedly acknowledged the fence placement every single time the lease was renewed. The Mauds were charged separately and each faced penalties of up to 10 years in federal prison for the fine, and also fines up to $250,000. So in a statement, U.S. Secretary of Agriculture Brooke Rollins said the charges stem from a fence line and planting dispute. A release from USDA said the Mauds were alerted by the U.S. Forest Service that fencing on their property blocked access to the Buffalo Gap National Grasslands, and agreed to a survey of the property lines after the survey was completed. The Mauds were indicted on the theft charges. And, of course, those charges now have been dropped. This is something that will be NCBA was also a big pusher for these charges to be dropped, and these charges were essentially aggressive and pointless. And again, I'm paraphrasing. That wasn't NCBA's exact words. Breaking down the EPA's new action plan for insecticides. So in the trio of ESA enforcement regulations, herbicides, insecticide, and fungicides, the industry now has 2 to 3 to consider. After the final herbicide rule was released in 2024, just yesterday, the EPA released its final insecticide rule. This comes after the draft insecticide rule was first released in July of 24, and the final rule takes into account the public comments provided during the comment period. These EPA regulations are a response by the agency to enforce the Endangered Species Act at the agency level rather than through litigation and the court system. And of course, there's been a lot of stories as of late around 2,4-D and Roundup as well. This EPA story is from AgWeb. There's a lot of concern that Bayer is going to pull glyphosate from the market and wouldn't be available, which would there's some consequences for you. On the 2,4-D front, just days after the one-year anniversary of its filing, Corteva received a vote from the International Trade Commission in its favor relating to its petition filed on April 24, 2024 with the U.S. Department of Commerce, calling for anti-dumping and countervailing duties on 2,4-D imports from India and China. The Department of Commerce will now issue and announce the final rule rates on the imported products. More than 1,500 herbicide products contain 2,4-D as an active ingredient. Leaders of the National Corn Growers Association and American Soybean Association responded to today's vote by the International Trade Administration with disappointment, saying, "We are concerned and alarmed by this ruling," said Illinois Farmer and National Corn Growers Association President Kenneth Hartman Jr. He said, "Corn growers should not be forced to rely exclusively on one domestic supplier. Today's decision threatens to cause availability shortages for 2,4-D that will hamper the work of our farmers who are facing a tough environment due to a prolonged period of high input costs and low prices." Whew. Fun. We got to do this news more often, everybody. I love it. I love getting through some of these top stories. So, hey, if you have any feedback, we'd love to hear from you. Send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com, and continue to go to realagriculture.com to find all the different stories and interviews and features that we're doing on a daily basis. Our team is passionate about one thing, and that is agriculture and helping you kind of understand, providing some insight on a lot of things that are happening in this industry. So we do appreciate you making us part of your day, as I say, every day on this program. Thanks so much for getting real and getting connected with RealAg Radio. Thanks for downloading the podcast. And we'll chat again tomorrow for the Farmer Rapid Fire, brought to you by Corteva. Talk to you tomorrow. Cheers, everybody.